Dr. Selina Heppell is a department head of Fisheries and Wildlife and Conservation Sciences. She devotes much of her research to some of the oldest and slowest growing animals in the sea turtles, sharks, sturgeons, and the U.S. West Coast rockfish. She primarily uses computer models and simulations to help us understand how populations respond to fishing and environmental change, guiding research and management policy towards their recovery. Selena is interested in finding ways to protect marine species and habitats while supporting local fisheries. Recently, she was the chair of the Ecosystems Management Subcommittee for the Science and Statistical Committee of the Pacific Fishery Management Council and regularly serves on advisory teams for marine conservation projects. She strives to bridge quantitative ecology and practical solutions to marine resource issues and has a passion for education at all levels. She started her marine biology teaching career at the early age of 12 as a volunteer at the Seattle Aquarium. Now, as department head of one of the largest academic departments on campus, she strives to keep OSU's programs the best in the country, and including our extensive online curriculum. And she was recently a host on our Tahiti trip, and our travelers had an amazing time with her on that tour. So welcome, Selena. Thank you for joining us.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kate, and welcome everybody. I'll go ahead and share my screen here, and we'll get started. All right. So, very excited to chat with you all tonight and talk a little bit about seafood. I'm a bit of a connoisseur of seafood, and we eat a lot of it at home. Scott and I, my husband, is a professor in our department and does a lot of research off the coast of Oregon and also in the Caribbean. So seafood is a bit of a passion of mine, and I love chatting with folks about it. I actually gave a version of this talk on the ship in French Polynesia. We ended up talking. What I didn't realize is that when you're on a cruise ship and you give a talk and you actually get recorded, and then they show your talk in people's cabins, like through the whole cruise. So I kept hearing my voice as I was walking down the various corridors of the ship. But anyway, so today we're going to talk about sustainable seafood at home and away. So some things you can be thinking about whether you're buying seafood here in Corvallis or elsewhere around the country, or while you're traveling abroad. So, I am a department head. I'm a professor. I'm an advisor of many students and faculty, and I'm a mom. I'm an OSU Beaver at heart, and my son is actually an OSU alumnus. So we're very happy to have him continuing in our footsteps. He'll be starting in the Marine Resource Management program this fall. I'm a marine fisheries ecologist and conservation biologist, and I'm also a scuba diver, and I sing a little bit. So that's a little bit about me and some of the work that I do. And but what we're mostly going to be talking today about is seafood, and I'm sure that many of you have favorites of different types of seafood that you really enjoy, whether it's shellfish or finfish and in whether it's in cooked form or raw form. I happen to be a big connoisseur of sushis and various cooked foods as well. So it's wonderful to try different seafoods as we're traveling, and then also tell people a bit more about the seafood industry and some of the issues that arise around seafood. So here's some food for thought, some things to think about. Fish and seafood are important for nutrition and provide about 3.3 billion people on this planet with almost 20% of their animal protein. It's generally more sustainable than other animal proteins, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Fisheries and aquaculture support rural communities worldwide and are often a very important occupation for women. So here we're at the fish market in Galapagos, and you see that women are running the show. They're the ones that are prepping the seafood and keeping track of the um, exchanges and all of the funds and so on. And I found that to be true throughout Latin America and many other places in the world. Fisheries and aquaculture support the livelihoods of 10 to 12% of the world's population, with some 60 million people directly engaged in capture fisheries and aquaculture. So it really is a big deal. Now, not so much in the United States. In the United States, we generally are eating seafood more or less as a luxury item rather than as a critical key protein. And our total per capita seafood consumption in pounds in the United States is around 16 to 18 pounds per year, and it's kind of leveled off. There was kind of an increase for a bit, and then it kind of went down again, and so it bounces around a bit. But in other parts of the world, seafood is a really important protein source. And well, Iceland, I've actually taught classes in Iceland, and they're eating about 5 times as much seafood as we do on a regular basis. And then there's many parts of Asia, in particular, are have very high seafood consumption. So the darker colors here are larger amounts of seafood per person per year in pounds. Now, there are issues that arise with seafood, and you may have heard about some issues that are associated with overfishing as a major threat to the oceans. Or maybe you've heard about this particular film that was shown on Netflix that pointed out some issues that arise with seafood and both capture fisheries and then other like aquaculture and things like that. And we have some issues, and there are some problems associated with catching food in the ocean, including fishing gear that can get tangled in, that animals can get tangled in or accidentally captured in. And fish farming also has issues. So we have some problems and issues that arise with aquaculture, particularly of things like salmon here in the Pacific Northwest. And we had a big fish escapement in a few years back up in Washington in northern Puget Sound. And some of those Atlantic salmon that were being raised have been found elsewhere and have actually, maybe, possibly, will be establishing populations here as invasive species. But there's good stories as well. And here on the west coast of the US, we have a lot of good news in that most of our fisheries have rebounded after some periods of overfishing. And we have seen a lot of good news stories coming out of the Pacific Fishery Management Council and National Marine Fisheries Service. Also, fish is very good for you. You have the benefits of eating fish that have been shown in a variety of studies looking at omega-3 fatty acids and other benefits that come from seafood. Plus, I think it's important to point out that we do have a growing human population on the planet. And while it would possibly be good to have everybody eating plant protein, that might not be very realistic. And so we need to be thinking about how to supply a growing human population with good protein and but at the same time making sure that we are maintaining healthy coastal ecosystems. So, why is seafood a good protein choice if you're going to eat animal protein? Well, it's low in fat and has good fats, what we call good fats. It's high in omega-3s, thiamine, trace minerals, B6, and so on. There's a high feed conversion ratio. So basically, the amount of food given to the fish or eaten by the fish converts into fish to for us to eat at a very high ratio. So tilapia and catfish have an extremely high conversion ratio. Farm salmon, not quite as good, but still pretty good. And then when you get up to some of the big fish like bluefin tuna, the conversion ratio isn't as good, but you see that it takes 1.6 kilograms of food to make 1 kilogram of fish, but that's comparable to chicken. Okay, so the amount of food it costs to and takes to produce the food is much less than pigs and cows and so on. Fish also has a lower carbon footprint than some other meats. And you see where fish falls just with tuna here relative to lamb, beef, cheese, pork, turkey, and chicken. The amount of CO2 that is produced in order to make 1 kilogram of fish is quite a bit lower than the amount that it takes to produce 1 kilogram of lamb or beef or pork. I was sad to see the cheese. Anyway. So let's look at some statistics and see what we know about fish capture and fish growing worldwide. And this is a great resource for some of those statistics. It's something that the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, FAO, puts out every 2 years. And so the most recent one is 2022 because they haven't got the 2024 one out yet. But I'll show you a few statistics there. So if we look at the amount of capture fisheries, so that's going out and capturing fish in freshwater or saltwater, okay, and you see that capture fisheries are in blue here, and they've really leveled out. They're at about 80 to 90 million metric tons per year. Whereas aquaculture, which has been layered on top of this, aquaculture continues to increase. Okay, so capture fisheries of wild fish have leveled off, and there's a growing industry of aquaculture, both marine and freshwater, with the largest increases in freshwater. So when I look at this, I see, okay, this is leveled off at about, let's call it 90 million metric tons. But I really don't have a sense of how much is 90 million metric tons. That doesn't really click for me. So I did a little research there, a little calculation. And it turns out that 90 million metric tons, if we compare that to the weight of the Empire State Building, that the weight of the Empire State Building is um, about 330,000 metric tons. Okay, so what that means is that it would take 273 Empire State Buildings to be equivalent in weight to the annual reported world fish catch. That's a lot, right? I mean, that's what you should be saying to yourself right now. Wow, that's a lot. And people have kind of two different responses to this. Some people, that might think right away, wow, that is such a huge removal of biomass of living animals from the oceans every year. That must be unsustainable. That's really bad, right? But then on the other hand, remember that 90 million metric tons is pretty stable over time. So another way to think about it is the oceans must be incredibly productive to produce that much protein every year. And really, both of those things are true, okay? Because it turns out that if we look at over time, we compare underfished, maximally sustainably fished, and overfished. That the numbers of stocks, and by a stock we mean a population of fish in the oceans. Okay, the numbers of overfished stocks have increased over time. The numbers of maximally sustainably fished stocks, so like we're fishing them at a rate at which they really can't handle any more fishing. That has also increased over time. And the number of underfished stocks that could potentially be harvested at a higher rate has decreased pretty substantially. So we're hitting the oceans pretty hard. Okay. And in fact, United Nations, based on these statistics and others, has determined that currently we are on a trajectory towards unsustainability. So we need to do some work in order to make sure that our oceans continue to be highly productive and really important and good sources of protein for the world's human population. Some solutions. What are they? Well, strong fisheries management. So, actually keeping track of how many fish are caught and then controlling some of that effort, which can be done in a variety of ways and is done in different ways around the world. Strong fisheries management. Okay. Then we can have sustainable and regulated aquaculture to make sure that we are continuing to increase the amount of fish and shellfish protein that's available to people without hitting the oceans harder. And then consumer awareness is really important. And that's what I'm going to focus on next. And that's part of where we want to go with our travel talk tonight. So, here we go. What is sustainable seafood? What does that even mean? Well, it has different definitions, but basically, fundamentally, what we're saying is that sustainable seafood is seafood that is caught or grown in a sustainable manner. And that's sustainable for the fish, for the environment, and for the fishery, for the people who are working on, catching those fish or processing them. There's a lot of factors to consider. The seafood supply chain is really complex and it is international. Okay. But good news is that there's a lot of resources to help you with that. This is Scott and Dylan many years ago now at a fish market in Italy. So here's some questions you can ask while you're choosing your seafood. First of all, you want to know if it's fresh or not, right? And so these are some things that you want to ask just to make sure that you're getting a good product. Well, for whole fish, the fish should have clear eyes and not be sunken in their heads. They should have red or pink gill fibers. If you pull up this, the plate that covers the gill there, you can see those fibers in there and make sure that they're red or pink in color. And the fish should have pretty firm texture and the skin should be fairly firm and not sloughing off. The fillets then, and a lot of times we buy fillets rather than whole fish. Those fillets should be the texture should be firm and not grainy. They should have nice color, and they really shouldn't smell very much, okay? Even though we think about fish as being pretty smelly, a fresh fish that is really good to eat doesn't have a very strong smell usually. Most seafood in the United States is actually flash frozen, and that can be a good thing. For one thing, it kills parasites, and those parasites also die when you cook the fish. And fresh is not always very fresh. Okay. So a fresh fish that's never been frozen may have been sitting on ice for a fairly long period of time. Some other countries actually have really strong regulations on that. And the fresh means that it can only have been on ice for a very short time. So, it's a little bit of a trade-off there. Our seafood, or sorry, our food labs up in OSU's food lab up in Portland has actually done some studies on this. And what they find is that most consumers, when you go and do the taste tests, find that that quick frozen fish actually tastes a little better than what's called fresh fish. Okay. And again, that would depend in part on how fresh the fish actually was. You might also be asking, is your fish versatile? Is it easy to prepare? And does it go well with the wine that you have on hand? So, those might be questions that you're asking about your fish. And those are good questions to ask too, because as I said, in the United States, fish is mostly a luxury item and it's fairly expensive. So, you want to be, judicious in your choices and make sure that you get the fish that you want and then are able to cook it well. Now, you might ask yourself, is my fish full of radiation or is it full of mercury or other contaminants? Well, the radiation question, the answer is not likely. And in fact, some analyses that have been done of, say, the albacore tuna off of our coast here, uh, 244,800 pounds of tuna would need to be eaten in order to meet the FDA safe yearly radiation exposure level for a person. Okay. And this is, this has been true. Was a lot of scare after the Fukushima disaster in Japan and so on. And it's certainly possible that a few of the fish that were bottom feeding and so on in that local area had levels of radiation that were too high and were potentially dangerous. But here on the other side of the Pacific, this is not an issue, and you really don't need to worry about that. Now, what about mercury? Well, depends. So, fish that are top predators and those that grow slowly can accumulate mercury in their tissues, and they can potentially have a high level of mercury, which doesn't mean you can't eat them. It just means that you shouldn't eat too much of them. Okay, so that would be bigger sharks, marlin, and the big and potentially swordfish, orange roughy, that's a bottom fish, a deep sea fish that grows very, very slowly, and I'm gonna talk about orange roughy in just a few minutes. And then some of the larger tuna. So bluefin and then big eye tuna are a slower growing, deeper sea tuna. Freshwater species can also accumulate toxins, and you can learn more about that on the EPA's website. So if for example, if you go fishing in some parts of the Willamette and other rivers around the country, it's a good thing to check and make sure that the fish that you're catching is okay to eat. And usually, what you'll find is that it is perfectly okay to eat, but you just don't want to eat a whole lot of it. You might ask yourself, where was it caught? So, was it locally caught or grown? And even when you're traveling, you can think about that. So, what are the local fish that are typically caught in this country or are imported into this country? Countries that have strong fisheries management are likely to have more sustainable fisheries. And countries or regions that depend heavily on seafood are also those that are more likely to have strong fisheries management. And then there's everywhere else, and it really kinda depends on where you are and what you're ordering. And I put this picture in here because I love to show this. So this is a few years old now, but this is a picture of, fresh salmon fillets. I took this picture in, Tallahassee, Florida. Okay. And in the United States, you probably noticed this at the grocery store now. They have labels, little markers that say whether it was wild or farmed and what country it came from. And this is just kind of amusing because there are no wild salmon in Chile. All the salmon that are grown in Chile are farm raised because salmon is not a native species to Chile. Now, as I said, this is a few years ago, and at this point, there have been enough escaped salmon from the farms in Chile that there are some wild salmon. But as best I know, they're not commercially harvested at this point. So if you see caught from Chile, you should be suspicious. All right, you might ask, was it caught or grown sustainably? So this can be hard to determine, and it does vary from country to country. And locally caught fish may be well managed and are often very important commodities for rural communities. Who decides whether a fish is sustainably managed or harvested? Well, there are certification programs and they work worldwide, like the Marine Stewardship Council, Aquaculture Stewardship Council, and Global Aquaculture Alliance. And then there are nonprofit, non-governmental organizations, like the Monterey Bay Aquarium does an analysis, and the Environmental Defense Fund, and then some others. In the United States, fisheries stocks are evaluated annually, and you can learn more about this on various websites about fish in the U.S. Most of our fish are in good shape and are not subject to overfishing and are not overfished. So subject to overfishing means that that means if they are if overfishing is happening, it means we're catching them too rapidly. We're catching too many relative to their ability to keep up with that catch, okay, through their own reproduction. And then overfished means that we've caught too many and the population is too small. So that's a little subtle difference there. But you can learn more about that in various websites through NOAA Fisheries. Now, the thing is, though, that the United States is a rich country, and there are other, countries that have very strong fisheries management, like the United States. Many other parts of the world don't have the oversight to fisheries that the U.S. and Australia and some parts of Europe have, and Canada, I should say. All right, you might ask yourself, how was it caught? Well, what was it caught? Some fish are caught with lines and hooks. Some fish are caught with nets that are fixed in space in the water, like gill nets. Some fish are caught with trawls that drag along the bottom or up in the water and catch fish in a big trawl net or in a seine, a big what we call a purse seine that scoops the fish up. And there are, in fact, some fisheries that are caught with harpoons. And each of these will have different potential impacts on the environment or on other species that are caught accidentally. You might also ask, how is it grown? So, aquaculture species might be grown on land in a closed system or in estuary or ponds or net and with net pens or lines. They might be, grown in the open ocean in pens or on lines if it's a shellfish like mussels. And what can be important is whether the fish that was grown was a local species or an exotic species. And one of the problems with that Atlantic salmon escape situation up in Washington is that those are not native species. Sometimes, though, the aquaculture that is going on is the growing of fish that are native to that location. Now, I have done a lot of work on what we call bycatch. So, sometimes other animals or habitats are negatively affected by the fishery or the aquaculture. Bycatch is the unintentional catch of animals during fishing operations like dolphins or turtles or birds or other fish. And there can be habitat impacts of certain kinds of fishing gear, like trawling, for example, if it's nets that go on the bottom, can harm the habitat. And of course, there's pollution because fishing operations do include nets and lines and so on that are sometimes lost at sea. In this picture, you can't see them too well, but right in the middle there, sorry, let me go back. Right there is a sea turtle. That sea turtle is actually alive and well. Well, maybe not well, but he's alive. And he will be well because this particular fishery, which is in the Adriatic Sea, the fishermen are actually trained in how to make sure that those turtles, if they catch one, are actually resuscitated and released alive. And there's lots of really exciting advances that have happened with gear, fishing gear, to reduce the bycatch and to reduce the impacts on habitat. And usually that's the result of a successful partnership with industry. So, an example are turtle excluder devices in the southeastern US, in Mexico, Costa Rica, and various other parts of the world, where the sea turtles get caught in the nets. But the turtle excluder device is actually put in the net so the turtle bumps up against that and then gets forced out of a hole in the top of the net. And that hole is covered by a little webbing, which reduces the loss of shrimp or fish that are being caught by the net. Another example is something called a pineapple trawl. That's the vernacular for it. It's a trawl that is used here in the Pacific Northwest to catch pink shrimp, Oregon pink shrimp. And this is the catch from one of those trawls. Um, after the bycatch reduction has been successful. And you see that all the shrimp was caught and just a few fish were caught, just a few. Okay. And that's a result of a change in the net design that has actually led to reduced finfish catch. They've also discovered that if you put lights on the net, on that trawl, then it frightens the fish, but not the shrimp, and so the shrimp swim down and go into the net, but the fish swim away, away from the lights and stay out of the net. All right, so what about species in trouble? And sometimes we hear about things like swordfish or other species that may have issues going on with them and might be overfished. But that's a hard question to answer because fish are actually really hard to count. We like to say they're kind of like counting trees, except they move and you can't see them. A species can be overfished in one ocean, but managed sustainably in another ocean. So, just the title, swordfish, doesn't necessarily give you very much information about whether a fish is overharvested or not. In the United States and other countries that have strong fisheries monitoring and regional management, we have a lot of information about whether a fishery or a fish species, I should say, is overfished or in trouble. There are resources to guide you in this, and one of those is called FishWatch, fishwatch.gov, and you can look up information about how species are managed. Some marine fish species are really vulnerable to overfishing, and some of the things that make them more vulnerable include they might grow really slowly or have low productivity. They might aggregate in one place at certain times of year, like these groupers. Nassau grouper is the fish that my husband Scott works on, and that's a species that has a very predictable time and place where they come together to spawn. So they're easy to catch and easy to overfish. Fish that have very high value, like shark fins for shark fins soup and some other species are make them more vulnerable to overfishing. And then poor monitoring or biological information can make a species more vulnerable. So I want to show you a little story about two different kinds of fish: skipjack tuna and orange roughy. Okay, so the orange roughy, that's that deep sea fish I was telling you about. And then the skipjack tuna is one of many tunas that are caught for canned tuna and then just for eating whole tuna steaks. All right, so the maximum size of these two, the skipjack gets to be about twice as big as the orange roughy. The number of eggs that a fish can lay is much, much higher for the skipjack tuna than for the orange roughy. The spawning frequency, so how often do the females in the population actually spawn? Skipjack tuna can actually spawn daily, or at least weekly. And the orange roughy, though, this deep sea fish, only spawns once every couple of years. Age at maturation is completely different for these two species. Skipjack tunas mature and start reproducing at the age of 1 or 2 years, whereas the orange roughy don't start spawning until they're 20 to 30 years old or even older. Maximum age of 4 to 6 years for a tuna, 50 to 150 years for this deep sea fish. And its natural mortality, so its likelihood of being killed or eaten by something, 40 to 60% per year for the skipjack and less than 5% per year for the orange roughy. So you can kind of think of this like a really long life, slow growing tree compared to a really fast growing tree, and see that two species can have really different likelihoods of being overfished. All right. Uh, we can also think about the people, though, and it's important to think about the people. Who are the folks who are actually bringing this seafood to the table? Were they well treated? Some seafood industries have unethical labor practices around the world, including child labor and indentured servitude, so effectively slavery. And that can include forced labor on boats at sea. And there was an AP investigation in this, and it is something that a lot of folks are looking into now in the seafood sustainability world. What about aquaculture? Is aquaculture the wave of the future? There's lots of kinds of aquaculture, as I mentioned. So, where it's being raised and how it's being raised is really important to think about. And there's shellfish as well as finfish. So, how we grow mussels and clams and oysters is quite different. And oh, and seaweeds, can't forget the seaweeds, quite different from how we grow finfish. Some of the concerns that arise from aquaculture are pollution, antibiotics, parasites, escapees, you have to catch fish to feed the fish. And then farms can undercut the prices for wild fisheries, and that's a big issue with farm salmon here in the Northwest. There is new regulatory oversight in the United States and an expansion, kind of an emphasis on aquaculture research and expansion in the US right now. But generally speaking, we grow very little fish in the US. Most aquaculture is happening elsewhere in the world. But it's still, even aquaculture is a better way to grow protein than mammals and birds, okay? And there are a lot of new feeds and multiculture systems, which is where you combine the seaweed and maybe some shellfish and fish all together in the same location. So the seaweed is removing the nitrogen waste from the fish, and the extra food gets picked up by the shellfish, and then you can grow the fish together with a mixed culture system like that. And in some parts of the world, as you're traveling, the best seafood or the most prevalent seafood that you can get is, in fact, farmed fish. This is Brancine, which is a sea bass, very popular in Europe, particularly around the Mediterranean and the Adriatic. And this is a farmed fish there, and they grow them in big net pens in Croatia, Slovenia, and Italy, and lots of other places. It's a delicious fish, and it does support a pretty important industry there. All right. Now, people always ask me, and everybody on on the Tahiti trip asked me, "Come on, tell me, Selena, tell me what is the deal, farmed or wild salmon?" So I went ahead, or farmed or wild fish. So I went ahead and put this together. And here are some things to think about with wild fish. There's a lot of choices, lots of variety, and they are very good for you. Often they have lower fat content and are more firm fish to eat, but they do occasionally have contaminants, especially in those longer lived species. They do have environmental impacts, although those impacts tend to be dispersed over larger areas. They support local industries and have more jobs per pound of fish that's produced. But wild fisheries do affect wild populations through the removal of those fish and the habitat impacts I mentioned. They do have natural coloration. Those are usually carotenoids that they get from their feed. So, fish that eat shrimp and species like shrimp in the ocean, so that would be the salmon, are orange in that bright, nice red and orange color because of those carotenoids. Sometimes, though, wild fish is mislabeled, and that can be a real issue. It's labeled sometimes you even order a fish and it turns out that it's a farmed catfish of what you actually ordered. On the farm side, you have limited choices, mostly whitefish and salmon in the US. It is a lot less expensive though. High omega-3 fatty acids and nutritious. There's very little difference actually in the nutritional value of farmed and wild salmon. There was a recent study done on that. It often has higher fat content. Antibiotics and feed additives do occur in farmed fish. There are environmental impacts. They tend to be localized right around the actual farm, but also we do catch fish to feed fish. It does support local industries, but there's fewer jobs per pound. And we can affect those wild populations because of escaped fish and potential disease transmission, although the science on the disease transmission is kind of mixed. And sometimes coloration is added, usually carotenoids, though, derived from natural sources. So we have our farm salmon and our wild salmon. I would just say, bottom line is there's no free lunch. About everything we do has impact, and it's really your choice of what you feel are the most important factors for choosing wild versus farmed. So, where are you at this point? I want to give you a few resources. So remember, who provides the review on sustainability? There are certification programs, and then there are a variety of non-governmental organizations. Seafood watch cards and websites can be quite handy, and they make them in different places for different parts of the US and also different places around the world. They're easy to read and use and display, and but remember that they're necessarily simplified and they may not include local information. There are studies in non-governmental groups that actually look at seafood legality and traceability, that are trying to make sure that the seafood that ends up sold at Walmart and Safeway and Albertsons and so on is actually sustainable seafood. And so there's a lot happening in the sustainable seafood arena, and it's not always on you to figure out what's sustainable. So you can find out which distributors are actually, being providing the more sustainable seafoods. Sustainable seafood education and research at OSU. We have a long-standing reputation for international program support through the Aquafish program. There's a new interest in aquaculture at OSU from the research office, the Marine Studies Initiative, and the College of Ag Sciences. And there are courses that you can take as a non degree seeking student or as a degree seeking student. And then we're hoping to produce some of what we call professional and continuing education courses, PACE courses. And then there's what can you do? Okay, so here's my advice for tonight. I really encourage you to try local seafoods when you travel and visit fish markets to experience local culture. Scott and I always make an effort to go visit the fish market wherever we are. Think about seafood sustainability factors that are most important to you. Do a little research on your favorite seafoods and check for sustainability certification. And you can use advice from a trusted resource online or otherwise, or you can actually produce your own seafood preference card. So you can think about list some of your favorite seafoods and then think about, okay, what is this a local species? Does it have low bycatch or low environmental impact, or is it farmed sustainably? Things like that. So you can choose what your columns are in your seafood preference card and then do a little research to determine what's right for you. Thanks so much, and hope we have time for a few questions. And just remember, everything we do has impact, but we can all reduce our global footprint.
This is really great. Thank you so much, Selena. I ate orange roughy growing up, and now
Sure.
I feel really bad about it.
Oh, no. No, just remember that some of those orange roughy could have been older than your grandmother.
Yeah, the guilt is still there. If anybody has questions, please do put them either in Q&A or in your chat box, either one. But I have a couple questions to get us going. So for thinking about when you go to the grocery store, you see a lot of, at least in the United States, you see a lot of the same labels: cod, salmon,
Mhm.
tilapia,
Mhm.
like a lot of the same types of fish. And it makes me think, what are we doing to the biodiversity of the oceans? Like,
Mhm.
because are we nitpicking certain species and just eating too many of those? Because we learn about how hunting and our land animals and everything and the balance can get off. What are we doing to our oceans that way?
Yeah, that's really interesting to think about because in the US, we primarily have fisheries that focus on certain species or certain kinds of species. And in some other parts of the world, like when you travel in the Caribbean, for example, fishermen catch lots and lots of different species, and they'll even, and this happens here too, but I think more often in small scale fisheries that they'll switch to whatever's most abundant at the time.
Mm,
Um, Again, it comes down to how the fisheries are managed and how they're monitored and whether we have a very good idea of how things are going in an area. And I think, one thing that I think is important to point out too is that local knowledge can be really valuable for this because
mm,
fishermen actually have a very good idea of what's out there and how abundant it is. And so we actually, here in the US, fisheries management to some extent, but I think in other parts of the world more so, we listen to what they have to say and sometimes incorporate that local or indigenous knowledge into the information that we have and the advice that we're giving for regulation. So it kind of depends on where you are and the kind of fishing that's happening. Um, Generally speaking, the ocean is really big, and we do have impacts. But if we figure out that we're having too much of an impact soon enough, if we back off, then things can recover, right?
true.
And whether that's, because we're fishing lots of different kinds of fish or one particular species very hard, either of those situations, we can get stocks to recover.
Yeah, that's great. So we have one question that came in. What scientific discoveries made aquaculture possible, and how
Mm.
many species can be raised with?
Oh, that changes all the time, right? And new species and new information and people trying different things.
Mhm,
People have farmed fish for thousands of years. Okay, aquaculture is not particularly new. Industrial aquaculture is relatively new, and so really, what's happened is to some extent for some species like Atlantic salmon. Um, Atlantic salmon have been raised in farms in Norway and some other parts of the world for a really long time. So we kind of have a domestic salmon to some extent.
mm,
And so the longer we breed the animals in captivity and kind of and get them used to being raised in pens, then that affects how well we can grow them, how fast we can grow them, and the kinds of and how successfully we can grow them, I guess. New species are tested all the time, and in different and with different kinds of cages and different kinds of growing techniques.
mhm,
So I think what's so exciting about aquaculture right now is that we're really looking into ways of reducing the amount of antibiotics, reducing
mm,
how much fish we have to catch to feed the fish, by looking at plant protein based feeds and other things like that. Figuring out how to have less waste so that the food is more efficient for growing the fish, and then that the leftover food and the fish waste can be collected and used for other things. So there's
mm.
lots of exciting things going on that I think are making aquaculture more sustainable.
That's great. And then, it just made me think of the bacon seaweed that
Yeah,
OSU.
seaweed that tastes like bacon, that's right, that's right.
Yes.
And that's dulse seaweed, it is there are some, test farms going on down in, Port Orford and some
Mhm.
other places along the coast here, and, yeah, so that's gonna be really interesting to see how those farms, come together and work together. A big one right now is, trying to get some of the sea urchins out of, the wild because there's too many of them,
Mm,
and they've kind of overpopulated, and so we can bring those sea urchins out of the wild and put them in tanks where we then feed them to fatten them up, and then they get sold mostly to, Asia because
yeah.
sea urchin is a little bit more popular seafood in Asia than it is here.
True. I think there was just an article that came out about OSU's work with sea urchins,
Yeah,
just like the other day.
yeah.
That's great. We had Jill wants to know, who do you think, and I know you can't endorse any store, but who do you think carries the freshest seafood in Corvallis?
Oh, no. Oh, no, I can't get myself in trouble there.
I know it's a
Um,
hard one.
yeah.
I guess
Well,
look at
first
the
of all,
eyes, right? We need to look at the eyes. We need to look under the gill flap.
yep, you can look at all those things. Really, if you want really fresh, good local seafood, go to the coast, go to
Mm,
Newport, buy it from the boats.
mhm.
You can and Oregon Sea Grant even has a little, workshop that you can attend where they call it Walk the Docks, and they
Yeah.
teach you how to walk along the docks and talk to the fishermen, that are selling s and they have licenses to sell their fish right off their boats, and that's the place to get the most fresh seafood, to be
Yes.
honest.
Yeah, right off the boat. And if you're down in Newport, I will say this because Local Ocean was started by an OSU
That's right.
alumnus, Laura. So I don't think she owns, I think she sold it to one of
She
the,
did, she sold it to her employees.
yeah,
And
yeah,
they
that's
run
so
it
great.
now, that's right. So she has some new things going on, in Newport, though, and she is a longtime, staunch supporter of
Yes.
Oregon seafood.
Yeah, sustainable seafoods.
Yes.
Yes. Um, Great. And then we have another question. We know very little about scientists who played important role in aquaculture, or do we know very little? I
Hmm,
We know very little about scientists who played important role in aquaculture. So I guess
hmm.
the famous folks that really made an impact in
Oh,
aquaculture, or
gosh.
was it more institutions that have done a lot of work, like
Mhm.
Woods Hole or Oregon State or certain or organizations, private
Sure.
organizations.
Yeah, so aquaculture is not actually my field,
Mm,
but, I am less familiar with the big names of aquaculture. Um, Auburn University has a
mm,
long-standing, quite famous aquaculture program. UC Davis is probably the best known on our coast. Oregon State, primarily our contributions right now are in oyster
mm,
aquaculture, and but in the past we've had quite a lot of different kinds of aquaculture at OSU. One of the things that we're working on a lot at Oregon State is breeding oysters that are resistant to lower pHs because of the acidification that's happening in the oceans.
mm.
So ocean pH is going down, and so that makes it so the oysters can't form their shells very well.
Oh,
And so we're doing some oyster breeding and just trying to understand what is going to be best for farmers that want to continue to grow oysters in that environment.
that's great.
So I'm sorry, I don't know the famous big names. You know what?
That's okay.
I bet they're like Norwegian.
Ah, probably.
Because like and Chinese,
Yes,
because like I
Chinese.
said, I mean, people have been growing for and you know what's another really interesting form of aquaculture that's happened is kind of more of a ranching thing that, we're learning more and more about in Polynesia and in
Yeah.
other Pacific islands where they would build these big enclosures for fish and then raise them with and feed them and grow them. So there's all kinds of different sorts of aquaculture that's happened over human history, and it's just but the recent improvements have been to try to do more aquaculture on a larger scale
Yeah,
for mass marketing.
that's great. So Melissa wants to know, what can I ask restaurants to help
Mm.
make a good choice? She feels that most waiters and chefs might not really have an idea of where their fish is really coming from.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I think you can at least ask, is it local or is it or not, right?
Mhm.
So if you order salmon, for example, you can ask where it was caught, and know if it was um, a fish from Oregon or from Alaska or whatever, right? And some restaurants really do pride themselves in having only purchasing sustainable seafood for their menus. Unfortunately, one of the issues that comes up, like I mentioned on the wild versus farmed, some fish is mislabeled. and it's sold as, in some cases with a high price. And it turns out if you actually did a molecular analysis, you would find that's not the fish that they say it is. So there's some efforts to crack down on that, and that's some of the traceability work that's going on that the NGOs are doing now.
I bet it's harder if you're in places like Kansas or
Mm.
Nebraska to
Okay,
really your sustainable seafood option if you're inland.
that's right. When Scott and I moved to North Carolina for graduate school, we went to we splurged. We didn't have any money. We were grad students, but we splurged and went to this fancy restaurant, and they had salmon was the big thing for the night. And so we asked them, well, what kind of salmon it is? And we're both from the Northwest, right? So we're wondering, is it Chinook? Is it coho? Whatever. And she said, well, it's blackened, or it's grilled, or
Yes. And that answered your question. Did you have
yeah.
chicken?
We didn't actually order the salmon that night.
Yeah. That is great. And so I think we talked about this. They rephrased your question. It said, who carries the freshest, most sustainable, fair practiced
Oh,
seafood?
yes.
Um,
Yeah, so Whole Foods and I believe Market of Choice, those higher end restaurants, let's face it, they have
mhm,
a consumer that can afford it, right? So those restaurants do tend to carry more sustainable fish products and often know more about it too.
mhm.
We used to have a fish market in Corvallis. It has now closed, and we had one before that too. We don't
Yeah,
seem to be able to keep a fishmonger in business, unfortunately, in Corvallis.
yeah.
So really, again, going to the coast to buy direct, or going to one of the places that specifically carries sustainable seafood products. But you can also look to see, because they do have to tell you where it was caught and if it's farmed or wild. So if you make the assumption that those labels are correct, then you can look on the Fish Watch website and see, is that a fish that's
Mhm,
sustainably caught, generally speaking, if it's caught in the US or if it's caught in Peru or wherever
mhm.
you think that's from.
So let's talk antibiotics because we hear this is something within the beef industry and the cattle industry too, because we don't want antibiotics in our foods. But when you're farmed and you're in an enclosed environment, you do have to do something to keep your disease and things at bay. So I guess how bad are these antibiotics really for us in the fish
Mhm.
industry and the seafood industry? And I mean, are we talking about large quantities or just a little bit, or is it how much of a concern is it?
Yeah. I don't have enough information on that,
Mhm,
and I'm sure that it varies by product. And so, shellfish is would generally have low antibiotics, if any. But finfish would be more likely to because you are raising them in high densities. And when you raise something in high density, then they spread disease more readily. So some forms of antibiotics are used, but not everywhere and not all the time. And
mhm,
that aquaculture sustainability certification can provide information on whether that product had significant antibodies in it or not. Whether those antibodies are actually transmitted to humans, antibiotics,
mm,
unlikely, to be honest.
yeah,
But I think it probably does depend on the product and so on. And again, it's not my area of expertise, unfortunately.
yeah. Wow, that's interesting though. Well, great. Well, then don't see any other questions that have come up. So we are after time. We're at 6:30. So if anybody else has any other questions, you can feel free to type it in. But just to let folks know, remind them where you can find us. We're at fororegonstate.org/travel. And then, of course, all of our tours are online, and you can read about all the wonderful places that we're going throughout the year. And then, of course, there's a little bit of conversation on Facebook, but if you want to check us out there, you can do that too. And I'm so lucky to have Selina back with us for our talk tonight. It's great to see you and have you back with a travel talk. And well, and we were just talking too, which trip she's going to go on next. So stay tuned because we are going to get her on another tour. But thank you all for joining us tonight, and thank you. Oh wait, let me see. I think I got one last chat. Everyone said it was a really great conversation. Thank you for the presentation. Very interesting. And so everyone loved your chat tonight. So
All
thank you
right,
very
great.
much.
Thank you,
All right.
everybody.
Have a great night. Bye.
Bye bye.